The Roman centurion was the backbone of the regular army, as well as the Roman link to the auxiliary forces. He commanded 100 fighting men who were ready to die at his command. He was the active day-to-day officer who drilled, supervised, and regulated the conduct of the common soldiers in his command. He was required to be a tough, professional soldier who could be brutal when required, yet exemplified reasonable character. In the 25 years of his enlistment, he hoped to rise through the ranks and become senior in his cohort, the best of 5 centurions who led 500 men. During the reign of Tiberius Caesar, in the jurisdiction of Pontius Pilate in Palestine, one particular centurion came face to face with Jesus Christ in a way no other man was able. This particular centurion was responsible for carrying out the execution of Christ. That experience left a permanent mark upon him. Today we go back in time to just a few weeks following these momentous events. The year 33 AD. The place, Jerusalem. We are gathered outside the court of the Gentiles on the perimeter of the second temple, built against the temple complex. On the north side is the massive fortress of Antonia, where Rome remains an appropriate military presence in order to exercise control of the region. Though the commotion and crowds that accompanied the recent Passover feast have since diminished, questions remain concerning the death of Jesus of Nazareth. And one particular soldier, the centurion who was in charge of the execution, has been incredibly impacted. He has finished his responsibilities for the day and was headed out of the fortress. We are not sure where he is going, but we have been graciously granted a few minutes of his time.
I have seen a great many men die at my side and at my hand. The way in which a man dies reveals who the man truly is. I am Julianus, centurion of the Roman army. I have served under the greatest of the Caesars, Augustus and Tiberius. My life was marked by an event that took place not long ago during this, the 19th year of Tiberius Caesar. After many years of bloody service in the border legions, I was assigned to the imperial troops of Pontius Pilate, located at his headquarters in Caesarea by the Mediterranean Sea. It was customary for Pilate during this season of Passover for him to move his armory, his men, and his office here to Jerusalem for the Passover feast. During this season, this most holiest of days for the Jewish people, these sons of Abraham would gather from all over the area and would swell the city of Jerusalem beyond its capacity. They usually brought with them great distress and increased conflict during this time of year because of the size of those who've come into the city. It was a time for the Jewish people, it is a time of feasting, a time of celebrating, and a time of remembering their deliverance from bondage in Egypt many, many years ago. They also longed for deliverance from us, from Rome. Well, it was here in Jerusalem where I saw Jesus, the Nazarene from Galilee, die. The way in which Jesus died was unlike any man I had ever witnessed. Because I was a centurion on duty for his trial and execution, I saw the events at close proximity. Now, I have stood at close quarters with many a man on trial before Pilate. And when faced with the death penalty, they all, with great sincerity and pleading passion, declared their innocence. While to hear them tell it, we Romans have never crucified a guilty man. But Jesus Jesus did not protest. He did not plead his innocence. You see, it began early in the morning as I was on duty with Pilate, when members of the temple guard, along with a few members of our company, escorted the prisoner from the dungeon of Caiaphas, the high priest, and brought him to Pilate early in the morning. It was obvious the prisoner had already been severely treated. He had been up all night. It had been quite cold. He'd already been beaten and abused when he came to us. Now, as he was brought to Pilate, normally the people bringing the accusation would come into the praetorium and declare the reason they are bringing the individual and what the charge would be. But the Jewish priests and rulers who brought Jesus would not come into the praetorium because it was the eve of the Passover and they did not want to be defiled by us Romans, and so they could partake in the Passover, so they remained outside. Pilate, much to his displeasure, accommodated their particular religious rules and went out to meet them. He came out on the steps and asked them, "What accusation do you bring against the prisoner that you have brought before me?" Now the response, their first statement to Pilate, I thought was somewhat amusing, though I held my tongue. They said, "If he were not an evildoer, we would not have brought him to you." Pilate said, "Listen, you take him and judge him according to your law. I want nothing to do with him." And then they said, "He deserves to die, and we do not have the power to carry out a death sentence. That is an authority that belongs only to Rome." You see, the Jewish leaders then said, they accused Jesus of three things. They accused him of perverting the nation. We're not sure what they meant by that. Had no bearing to us or to Pilate. Secondly, they said he was forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and that may be of some interest to us, but nothing significant. Usually cared for by the other courts. Why come to Pilate? The third one intrigued Pilate. They accused him of saying that he was king of the Jews, which apparently they did not believe. So with that, Pilate went back into the praetorium, summoned the prisoner. Jesus was brought before him, and Pilate questioned him and said, "Are you the king of the Jews?" To which Jesus responded with a question, something along the line of this. He said, "Are you asking this of your own initiative, or did someone else tell you this about me?" To which Pilate said, "I am not a Jew, am I? It's your own nation and chief rulers have delivered you to me. What have you done?" And to that Jesus responded, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would fight so that I would not be delivered over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." Well, Pilate now is very confused, and I must admit, so are we. We're thinking, this man doesn't have it all together. And when Pilate heard this, he said, "Well, so you are a king?" To which Jesus said, "You say correctly that I am a king. For this cause was I born, and for this purpose came I into the world, to bear witness to the truth. And everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." When Pilate heard that, he didn't know what to think. He walked around a little bit and kind of threw his arms up and said, "What is truth?" And with that, he went back out to talk to his accusers and said to them, "I find no guilt in him." He intended to release him. But the Jewish rulers and the gathering crowd were beginning to become more agitated. And they stirred up the people and said, "Listen, he is inciting rebellion. Everywhere he has gone from Galilee to here, his teaching is rising up the people." When Pilate heard that he had come from Galilee, he inquired. For if he was a Galilean, which he learned that he was, he would fall under Herod's jurisdiction. See, Herod the Tetrarch of Galilee also brought his headquarters here during this season. And so Pilate determined that he would send Jesus to Herod to free him from dealing with this Jesus matter. I was tasked with the responsibility, along with my quaternion, the 4 men who serve under me to carry out the execution, along with the remainder of our cohort. The 5 of us took Jesus and escorted him to Herod. Herod was so glad to see Jesus. Herod had so longed to see him. He had wanted to see him. His hope was that Jesus would entertain him, that he would do some magic tricks and perform some miracles. He questioned Jesus at length, but Jesus didn't say a word. He remained completely silent in Herod's court. Herod didn't know what to do with him. He wouldn't do what he wanted him to do, and so he granted opportunity for his own soldiers to spend some time with Jesus, to mock him, to beat him. They put a royal robe upon him, and then he said to me, "Take him back to Pilate." So we escorted the prisoner back to Pilate and explained to Pilate what had happened. So again, Pilate comes out of the praetorium, comes out to the Jewish people and says to them, "Listen, you brought the prisoner to me, and I examined him in your presence concerning the charges you have made, and I have found no guilt in him. I have sent him to Herod. He too has returned him to me and has found no reason for the cause of death. And so it is our intent to release him." Pilate did tell them that he would punish the prisoner. And in fact, while he was explaining this, we were carrying out the instructions that Pilate had given us in the courtyard. We were administering what is the 3rd of the Roman beatings, the lightest of all of them, the fustigatio. When we completed that, Pilate's hope was that this would satisfy the people. They would be content with having beaten the prisoner and then released him, teaching him the lesson that they'd hoped he would learn. But the people would not have it. They said, "No, he must be put to death." They said, "We have a law, and according to our law, he should be put to death because he claimed to be the Son of God." Now, Pilate went back into the praetorium and summoned the prisoner. We brought Jesus back to Pilate, and Pilate inquired about him again. He asked him this question, "Where are you from?" Jesus didn't answer. Pilate insisted, "Where are you from?" Jesus stood silent. Pilate said, "Do you not speak to me? Do you not know I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you?" Jesus spoke, said to Pilate, "You have no authority but such as given you from above. And he who has delivered me to you, has the greater sin." Pilate went back out to the people and said, "Listen, I find no guilt in him." Pilate was thinking through, what could I do? What could I do? The people were demanding that he be put to death. And Pilate thought of one last idea. In fact, it was a common thing to be done at the time of the feast. It was not uncommon in this case for Pilate as the governor, to grant to the people a prisoner to be released, a prisoner of their choosing. So Pilate thought, well, what I will do is I'll present to them one of the prisoners, and one of the men that we held was quite a notorious prisoner by the name of Barabbas. And so he intended, as he talked with the leaders, that I will give you the choice. I will prepare a prisoner, Barabbas and Jesus, and you will choose among them. And he went in to make preparations. With that being introduced, the chief rulers began to talk among the crowd. And we're saying, when the choice comes, call for Barabbas. When the choice comes, call for the release of Barabbas. Pilate returned and sat in the pavement, that which is called Gabbatha, the seat of judgment. And as this was being prepared and as the prisoners were being brought out, word came to Pilate from his wife. His wife said, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man." She said, I was tormented in a dream last night because of him." Now Pilate was desperate to release Jesus. So then came the time, he said, "Who would you have me release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called your Messiah?" The crowd cried out, "Away with this man! Release to us Barabbas!" He said, "Well, what would you have me do with Jesus?" And they said, "Crucify him. Crucify him." But I said, "Well, what has he done? He's done nothing wrong. Give us Barabbas. Crucify him." And the crowds chimed in. It echoed through the area, "Crucify him. Crucify him." I have never heard a nation of people cry out for the execution of their own like I did on that day. Pilate released to them Barabbas. Jesus was sent in, and Pilate sentenced him to death. But first, we would carry out the veberatio, the most severe of beatings. We took Jesus from the courtyard into the middle of the praetorium. We stripped him of his clothes, tied him to the post. And then my men took their successive turns in flogging the prisoner, flogging until I called them off or they became exhausted. I have been involved in the scourging of numerous men. I have never heard anyone bear the scourge in silence. Jesus did not protest his death sentence. He had been silent to this point, but I was certain, as the lash with its parts of metal and bone embedded in it, as it ripped open his flesh, that the silence would be broken by his screams. For I have never heard a man bear the lash in silence before. But beneath the repeated lash, I heard only the hiss of his escaping breath. We continued to amuse ourselves at his expense. Because he claimed to be a king, one of our soldiers picked up a reed nearby and placed it in his hand. Another took some thorns and wove them into a crown of thorns and placed it upon his head. We put a robe upon his shoulders. The men took turns smiting him and hitting him and crying out, "Hail, King of the Jews! Hail, King of the Jews!" And they took the reed from his hand and hit him with the reed. Sometimes men did not even survive the scourge, would never make it to the cross. Yet in all of this, the Galilean remained silent. When we had completed our responsibility, brought the prisoner back to Pilate, Pilate prepared to bring him forth. He'd already released Barabbas. He still wanted to free Jesus if he could. Pilate returned, and he told them, "I'm bringing him out now. But I want you to know that I am not responsible for him." There was a basin of water nearby, and Pilate washed his hands in front of the people and said, "I am innocent of this man's blood." The people cried out, "His blood be upon us and upon our children." With that, the prisoner was brought out, bloodied, beaten, the crown of thorns, the robe upon him. And Pilate said, "Behold the man." Pilate said, "You take him. You crucify him." They said, "No. If you release him, you are not Caesar's friend. For anyone who proclaims to be a king is in opposition to Caesar." See, the Jews were prepared to send to Tiberius Caesar and let them know that Pilate was ready to release a self-professed king. And they knew that Pilate could not risk the ire of Tiberius. Pilate was already in trouble with him, and he could not risk another situation. So then Pilate realized he was out of options and said, "Behold your king." They cried out, We have no king but Caesar. Away with him! Crucify him! Crucify him! And so we took the prisoner and prepared him for crucifixion. We took the robe from him and put his clothes back upon him and prepared him for the journey. I was strangely drawn to this prisoner. I can't explain it, but watching him through this whole thing, he didn't say a word. He didn't say a word. He endured the beatings, the accusations. Not a word. Not a word of defense. Not a word of anger. Not a word. There was no outcry from him as we journeyed from the Praetorium to Golgotha, the place of the skull, where we would crucify him. He carried the crossbeam, the patibulum, upon his bloodied and bruised shoulders until he collapsed beneath its weight on the outskirts of the city. I pulled a man from the pressing crowd and gave him the responsibility to carry the crossbeam the remainder of the journey to Golgotha. When we arrived at the place, my men placed him upon the patibulum and drove the nails into his hands. Not a word came from his lips. It was fastened to the upright beam, and his feet nailed as well, and the cross was lifted into place. And he stood there before us. My 4 soldiers had completed the primary responsibility entrusted to them. They sat nearby and divided the garments that he would no longer need. The crowd was gathering. They'd followed us to the place of the skull. The rulers were there, the people, the crowd they had brought with them, and they were mocking him on the cross. It's like they just couldn't let him go for whatever reason. Mocking him and yelling at him. Chief priest said, "If you are the Christ, come down from the cross, and then we'll believe you, if you are the chosen one of God." We had carried out the execution of 2 other criminals as well on that day, one hung on either side of Jesus. Even one of those joined in the abuse, yelling at the Christ, saying to him, "If you are the Christ, save yourself and us with you." The other one did not join in the mocking. He and Jesus exchanged some words that I did not overhear. I'm not sure what Jesus said to him, but I do know this. Whatever he said changed the entire demeanor and frame of mind of that prisoner. This one who was disquieted, fearful, struggling to survive in the face of death, now hung there, calm, contented. I've always wondered, what did Jesus say to him? Well, I finally looked into his eyes, and for the first time, he looked at me. But I saw in his eyes no hatred, no anger toward me, the one responsible for his execution. In fact, I saw what looked like compassion. And then he broke the silence with words that I think were directed at us, the soldiers, and maybe those beyond us, but certainly to us. He lifted up his head and said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." I was amazed at his words. As he hung there on the cross, as people came by, wagging their heads, disgust, mocking, making fun of. it hit me. It struck me with great force. You see, I have been in Jerusalem on numerous Passovers with Pilate. We are stationed here at the fortress of Antonia, built right up here against the temple wall. The high tower allows us to see into the courtyard. I have seen thousands of Passover lambs as they were slain and their blood dashed upon the altar. I always marveled at how a lamb died without any protest, silently before the slaughter. That's how the Nazarene was dying. Indeed, his death was unlike any man I'd ever seen before. It was like an innocent sacrificial lamb. He made no protest. He pleaded for no innocence. Silently, he faced the execution. Something else about the way he died struck me. As I said, I have seen many a man die. And every other man I have seen die has struggled and fought and scrapped to stay alive. But Jesus seemed to be willingly giving his life. It reached its greatest focus and intensity at Golgotha, where we crucified him. It was about the midpoint in the day, when the sun should be at its highest, that a strange darkness covered the face of the earth. I wasn't sure what was taking place. At first I thought it was an eclipse, but it was the time of the full moon, so it wasn't possible. This darkness was supernatural in some way, and I drew closer to the prisoner for fear that maybe someone would come and try to take him in the darkness. The crowd, the noisy crowd, became hushed as the eerie darkness fell upon the land, uncertain as to source or its cause. For 3 hours, the menacing darkness covered the face of the earth. As I drew closer to him, I was probably the only one close enough to even see his face. Near the end of the period of darkness, he said something in what I knew to be Aramaic, but I wasn't sure what it was. But his face, for the first time, was marked by anguish and grief, great pain as he cried out those words that I didn't know what they meant. And then he spoke with a clear voice. It is finished. He used a Greek word which I had heard hundreds of times in business transactions. It simply meant the debt is paid in full. It was a cry of victory, not defeat. And then he lifted up his head and cried out in a clear voice, Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit. And then he died. You see, I have seen men hang on the cross for days. For days. But this man just willed himself to die, and he died. Pilate had sent other soldiers to us because the Jews had requested that the prisoners be killed and taken down from the cross before the Passover was to begin, which was in about 3 hours. But as they were journeying on their way, and before they came to us with the message, the earth began to shake. And a violent shaking. It wasn't like any other earthquake I had felt. And I didn't know what to believe. I moved closer to the cross, and my fellow soldiers moved in close to me. I could feel their fright as they pressed up against me. As I looked up at this one who had just died, I said, truly this was a righteous man. Truly this was a son of God. One of my One of my soldiers said to me, "Sir, I have never seen a man die like that before." No, indeed, he died like the sacrificial lamb, silent, without protest. But he also died like the sovereign Son of God, fully in control, willingly giving his life. Well, when the soldiers began to break the legs of the prisoners, they would break the legs so that they would no longer be able to push themselves up on the cross and to be able to breathe, so they would soon suffocate and die. They came to Jesus and realized that he was dead already, but one of the soldiers wanted to make sure, so he thrust his sword in his side. Water and blood flowed out, giving clear evidence that he was dead. At the same time, word came to me that Pilate wanted me. He had summoned me, and so I made my way to Pilate. Apparently, a gentleman by the name of Joseph, a well-to-do Jewish man, had asked permission for the body of Jesus to bury it. So as I returned to Pilate and spoke to him, Pilate wanted to know from me, because it was my responsibility, it was my word that would give the verdict. He wanted to know, is he dead? I said, yes, he is dead. So Pilate granted the request. So I returned to Golgotha to carry out my final task, to oversee the burial of Jesus. Joseph and another man joined him, along with a couple of women, took the body off the cross, wrapped it in a clean linen, carried it to a nearby tomb. They were planning to come back in a few days to properly anoint the body. They rolled a large stone in front of the opening to prevent access until they returned. With my duty completed, I returned here to the fortress of Antonia. I have been in charge of the execution of many men. I have never had a sleepless night in my life. Never. But that night, I could not get the Nazarene out of my mind. I tossed and turned upon my mat. I reflected on him, his body lifeless, hanging on the cross. And for the first time in my life, I felt shame. I felt as if he should have been the one standing, and I should have been the one dead on the cross. Well, the next day was the Sabbath, normally a quiet day in Jerusalem. I was alongside Pilate for the responsibilities of the day when the Jewish rulers came in again. It must have been something of significance for them to violate the Sabbath to come to see Pilate. They said to him, and Pilate thought he was done with Jesus. They said to him, "Listen, when this deceiver was alive, he said that after 3 days he would rise again. And so send your troops to seal the tomb with the seal of Rome and secure it at least till after the third day. Because if his disciples were to come and steal the body, then this last lie would be worse than the first." Well, again, Pilate wanted nothing more to do with Jesus. He said, "You go, take your temple guard and seal the tomb. You may do it under my authority, but use your own guard." And so they left to seal the tomb with the authority of Rome with their own temple guard. The next morning, I was awakened by another earthquake, similar to the one on the day that Jesus died. The building held well, and I was already awake, so I went out about my day. As the day wore on that evening, I determined that I would fortify myself with a little bit more than my usual draught of wine. So I made my way to one of the places where the soldiers frequently gathered to drink. While I was there, I saw several of the temple guard. They seemed to have a lot of money, drinking excessively. One of them was the captain of the temple guard, and I knew him well. I got him off over into a corner, and I began to inquire of him. The wine had loosened his lips, and he told me of what had happened that day. He said he, along with 14 men, were assigned the responsibility to guard the tomb of Jesus. He said they had talked about what an easy assignment it was to guard the tomb of a dead man. They remembered the followers of this Jesus having fled from the garden a few nights ago, and they had no fears that they would come. But then he said this morning, when the earthquake happened, he said, you won't believe this. You will not believe this. He said, but this shining being, an angel, he said, appeared at the earthquake. And we went down. I mean, we were scared to death. And this being, this angel, rolled the stone away and sat upon it. So we fell down like dead men. He said, as we were trying to come to and gain our wits about us, a couple of women had come to the tomb, he said, who were followers of Jesus, and the angel spoke to them and said, do not be afraid. I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen, as he said. Come, see the place where he lay, and then go tell his disciples that Jesus is alive from the dead. I didn't know what to believe. The captain said that once he was able to regain his strength, the angel had left, the women had left, he had the courage to finally go in and check for himself. And he said it was true. The body was gone. Oh, the linens that they had wrapped him in were there as if they were undisturbed, just as if the body just left. The linen that was around his head was wrapped up and set off to the side by itself. He said now they were really scared. They returned to the chief priests and reported what had happened. The priests had a plan. That's where they got the money. The priests gave to each of them a large sum of money and then gave them a cover story. They told them, here's what you say. If anybody finds out and they ask, you tell them that the disciples came while you were sleeping and stole the body. And if Pilate hears about it, we'll make sure you're cared for. Well, that was quite the story. That was quite the story. Then I realized that this man's death indeed was unlike any other I had ever witnessed. You see, he had died. He had died like a sacrificial lamb, silently, submissively. He had died like the sovereign Son of God, triumphantly. And now I learned that he had died like one whom death cannot hold. For he conquered the grave. He conquered death. He was victorious over the one enemy that I thought no one could beat. It's time for me to go. You must consider what I have said. You must consider Jesus the Nazarene. You must consider that he is unlike anyone. I am not by nature or training a religious man. I have known no other allegiance than to the reigning Caesar and his sword. But this Jesus is greater than all the Caesars. For no Caesar has ever risen from the dead. I do not fully understand all that it means, but Jesus is divine. He is the Son of God. And I will look for him, and finding him, I will worship and serve him.
We don't know what became of the Roman centurion who looked upon the face of Christ on the cross and proclaimed that Jesus was truly the Son of God. But perhaps Because of this experience, he transferred his allegiance from the reigning Caesar to the risen Christ. More importantly for you and I, today, where is our allegiance? What do you believe about the Son of God who died in your place? He who died in your place is ready to receive you today. Today is the day of salvation. And if you are already a believer, a disciple of Jesus Christ, what is your level of allegiance? Is the risen Christ reigning today in your life? Is he free to command your will? Perhaps today you will renew your allegiance to the risen Lord.